اندیشکده مهاجر و معاونت محترم فرهنگی دانشگاه صنعتی شریف. عرض ادب ویژه‌ای باید داشته باشم خدمت اساتید بزرگواری که امروز در خدمتشون هستیم، جناب استاد دکتر گلشنی بزرگوار و جناب پروفسور مظفر اقبال که در خدمت هر دو بزرگوار خواهیم بود و مستمع صحبت‌هاشون خواهیم بود انشاءالله. من اجازه میخوام تا به جناب اقبال هم یه خوش آمدی عرض کنم به زبان انگلیسی که شاید قاعدتا بهتر متوجه میشم. Dear Professor Iqbal, I warmly welcome you and it's an honor hosting you in this session. I hope you pleasant hours in our university and if God wants, inshallah, we will listen to your lecture in coming minutes. خب، البته پیش از سخنرانی جناب پروفسور اقبال در خدمت استاد دکتر مهدی گلشنی خواهیم بود و بعد از سخنرانی دکتر گلشنی انشالله در خدمت جناب استاد اقبال خواهیم بود. به افتخار دکتر مهدی گلشنی.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحیم. خدمت همکاران عزیز و حضار محترم سلام عرض می‌کنم و به اونهایی که دعوت کردن جناب آقای دکتر اقبالی سخنرانی داشته باشن ازشون تشکر می‌کنم. آشنایی من با جناب دکتر اقبال به سال 74 برمیگرده. کنفرانس خیلی بزرگی بود در اسلام آباد پاکستان و اون موقع که آقای لهاری رئیس جمهور بودن و اونجا با هم آشنا شدیم. ایشون دبیر اون کنفرانس بزرگ بودن. بعداً جاهایی ملاقات داشتیم، از جمله در انجمن بین‌المللی علم و دین که افتتاح میشد. هم بنده هم ایشون جزو اعضای هیئت مؤسس بودیم و یک کنفرانس خیلی خوبی در سال 2003 یعنی 82 در اسلام آباد پاکستان برگزار کردن که مقالات اون کنفرانس تحت عنوان گاد، کوزموس و چیز از کریشن چاپ شد در خارج از کشور. کتاب بسیار خوبیه، ترجمه هم شده است. جناب دکتر اقبال بعد از اینکه پاکستان بودن رفتن کانادا و اونجا هم انجمن علم اسلامی را انداختن و هم مجله اسلام و ساینس را. در 15 سال گذشته این مجله اسلام و ساینس منتشر می شده، جزو مجلات خیلی خوب جهان اسلام بوده و بتونید توی سایت هم برید و مقالاتش را دریافت کنید. بیشتر به صورت همون اینترنتی هست، البته قبلا بیشتر به صورت مکتوب منتشر میشد. ما خیلی خوشحالیم که در خدمت ایشون هستیم و امیدواریم که همه لذت ببرید از سخنرانی ایشون. I invite Dr. Iqbal to come and benefit us here. Thank you.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحیم. الحمد لله رب العالمین والصلاة والسلام علی رسولک الکریم. اللهم صل وسلم وبارک علی سیدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه اجمعین. I'm very honored to be here this morning.
You can sit there, and after that we have questions. You can sit there.
You don't want to talk.
چون برای پرسش و پاسخ اینا میگفتم یا مثلا یه خلاصه از صحبتشون. I don't know if you want, you can sit there to speak. Yes.
I like to speak standing.
Okay.
If you can sit there.
Okay.
No, you sit.
No.
Please take the microphone.
After your speech, we'll sit there.
I'd like to thank Dr. Gulshani and the university for inviting me here. As Dr. Gulshani mentioned, our friendship goes back to 1995 when we held a very important conference on science in the Islamic polity in the 21st century in Islamabad. And since then, it has been a pleasure to come to Iran several times and see and meet friends and colleagues and students. I first came to Iran in 1985 during the war that was imposed on Iran. And I remember the sound of air raid sirens because the Iraqi planes were coming to Tehran by that time. And since the revolution, Islamic revolution in Iran in 79, I've very closely watched certain aspects of the changes which have emerged. And I hope and my wish is that there will be a new understanding of the relationship between science and Islam, between technology and Islam, between technology and Muslims, emerging from these deliberations in Iran and elsewhere. The topic that I have chosen for today's talk is rather complex. The topic is, does science have religion? It is a complex topic because of the history that has gone into the making of this discourse. In the 1980s, early 1980s, there was a huge effort in the Muslim world and Muslims living in the West to create a paradigm of knowledge based on Islam. There was a movement of Islamization of knowledge pioneered by scholars like associated with the Triple IT, for instance, Ismail Rajai and others. The movement that emerged to understand the relationship between science and religion dates back to the 19th century, and it started in Europe. In the 19th century, especially after Darwin, there was an increasing awareness that there is a conflict between science and religion. But by religion, only Christianity was meant. The debate originated in Europe. Europe had a specific history of interaction of science with Christianity through the well-known and famous Galileo affair and what happened after that. So the discourse on science and religion was embedded in the history of Christianity. But instead of labeling the discourse as science and Christianity, they called it science and religion. Because religion was a broader term, and for better or worse, the worldview at that time was religion means Christianity. And the reason, one of the reasons, was that Islam was nowhere on the world scene in the 19th century. If you look at the map of the world in the 19th century, you will see that a very small portion of the lands, traditional lands of Islam, where Muslims have lived for centuries, had any kind of intellectual activity in the 19th century. Most of the countries were either directly occupied by France and England, or indirectly influenced by France, England, Russia, and to some extent Italy and Germany. Iran is an exception in the sense that, unlike the Indian subcontinent, the most of the Arab world, Afghanistan is also an exception to some extent. Iran was not directly occupied by a colonial power. But wherever the colonial powers went, they disrupted the religious and the educational transmission of knowledge, institutions, the bloodline of institutions, of the madrasas, for example. They took the lands away, they took the shops away, they cut off the process of transmission of knowledge in the Muslim lands. They changed the language of discourse, they changed the institutions, they changed the educational system, and therefore there was very little understanding. There was no science in the Muslim world. We didn't have universities producing science. So the discourse, the relationship between Islam and science, the topic of my talk today, has to be understood within this historical dimension, that there was no discussion of the relationship of Islam and science when the discourse emerged in Europe, especially during the time of Darwin and after that. It started at the time of Galileo, progressed slowly, but it blossomed and came into center stage after Darwin. Because the theories that started to emerge in sciences, especially biology, were in direct conflict with Christian teachings. So a conflict model emerged, science and religion. These were considered to be two separate entities in conflict with each other. When the discourse was transferred over to the other religions, the whole framework was also part of that transference. So they sought to find conflict between science and Islam, science and Judaism, science and Hinduism, science and Buddhism, because the model that was first constructed was a model of conflict out of a very specific cultural and civilizational background of Europe. The reaction to that whole emergence of this discourse was a secular view that said that science has no religion. Science is just science. You can do science in Medina or in Paris or in Mecca or in Washington DC, it will be the same science. So that is one single point that I want to present to you today. Does science have religion? Or is science just science? I don't know how many of you are following me. Is there a need for a Farsi translation? Yes? It's okay? If there is need, we can summarize. Yes or no? But I want to hear the greater. Are you okay with English? Yes. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. So that will save us time. The single point that I want to present to you and explore certain aspect of that point is, does science have religion, or is science just science? In order to understand this, we first need to define what do we mean by science. in order to understand whether or not science is neutral or science is religion, we need to know what we are talking about. When we say science, what do we mean? There is no such thing as science that is taught as such. Because when we say science, we now mean various disciplines: chemistry, physics, biology, astronomy. Various disciplines now have been defined as sciences, and the total accumulated body of investigation of the natural world, the physical world, the manifest world, collectively is the domain of science. Included in this investigation are also the branches of science such as psychology, which deal with the investigation of human beings in a non-physical sense. So we have physical sciences and we have non-physical sciences such as psychology, anthropology, sociology. But the specific aspect of science that we are discussing today relates to the physical sciences only. Because if we go include the humanities in our discussion, then the debate will be of a different nature. I want to remain focused on the sciences which investigate the physical world, not the humanities. That's a different topic. In other words, the question then is, does chemistry have a religion? Does physics has a religion? Astronomy, etc. That is the question. The next point that I want to present is that what, collectively speaking, all of these branches form what we call science. What is the nature, what is the structure of the enterprise of science? We have defined that science is a collective body of various branches such as chemistry, physics, biology, etc., which together investigate the structure of the physical world. But what is the of the enterprise of science? Where does it come from? These are the dimensions of the enterprise of science that would help us to define and understand whether or not science has a religion. Because science is a human activity. It's not an abstract, vague idea that happens to somebody's mind and they write poetry about it. It's a physical activity. It requires institutions, it requires labs, it requires universities, it requires teachers, it requires students. It's a physical enterprise that is embedded in the structure of the civilization where it takes place. Now we have a sociology of science, meaning science takes place in a human society collectively. And presumably, the results of the investigations of science are shared with all humanity, although that's not the case anymore, as we know. The results of the investigations are not open source anymore, as Iran knows very well. Results are kept secret. Certain results are made public, but many results are kept secret because there is economics involved in the results. There is politics involved in the results. Because now science, the scientific knowledge, has power to produce technologies which have relationship with economics. So we need to understand that science, the enterprise of science, has layers and layers of other structures added to the activity of the scientists. There is politics, there is economics, there is sociology, there is a layer of the civilizational structure of the place where scientific activity is taking place. What is the concept of the physical world within the worldview of that civilization? Because if sciences of nature are studying the heavens, the stars, the planets, the trees, the vegetation, human beings, they must have a preconceived idea of the object of study. Meaning, in botany, for instance, if we are studying the nature of the plants, of the fruits, what is the preconceived idea of the scientists studying the science of botany? Where did the oranges come from? Is there a trust, an amana? Is there a relationship of human beings with these trees? Or are they just lifeless entities which can be destroyed, changed, manipulated in any way that we want? These are beliefs embedded in the investigation, in the scientific investigation. So, there are metaphysical beliefs embedded in the enterprise of science because the universe, the cosmos, the physical entities that the scientists study have to be conceived in one or the other way. These beliefs, whether the cosmos, the entire structure of the physical world, has come into existence on its own, is just a collection of atoms and molecules, governed by certain laws, certain forces, or did this cosmos emerge through the command of a creator? The object of study of sciences, meaning the physical manifest universe, have come into existence through some mechanism that science studies. The question that is at the root of understanding the question that is the topic of this lecture, whether science has religion or not, is this fundamental question. And I want to dwell on it for a few minutes to make it clear that what we are talking about is not only, although that's included, but not only what happens in the lab. You asked me a question a little while ago whether a boiler is scientific or not, and I said if an NMR machine is sitting in Medina and Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim is written on the top of the machine, would that NMR machine produce Islamic nuclear magnetic resonance spectra, or would it be just the same spectra as it is producing in Washington, D.C.? So the question is built into this understanding, this fundamental question, that the object of the study of sciences, meaning the physical universe, what is the concept of that enterprise of science about the subject? Is it divinely created? Or it came into existence through some big or small bang, and then forces built into that initial explosion produce the rest without a plan, without divine control, without any destiny, without any future. For instance, Aristotle thought that matter has always existed. Matter has always existed. And it changes forms under the influence of forces. So our question then is related to the question of how the object of study of sciences is conceived. And that is a meta-scientific question. It does not involve experimentation. It's a question of belief. It's a question of belief held by the community of scientists or the overall enterprise of science. And the point that I want to make, the distinction that I want to make, is that the fundamental distinction between Islamic worldview of the physical manifest cosmos and non-Islamic secular view of the manifest world, of the physical world, is that in Islam, we believe that the world, that the natural world, the physical world, the manifest world that the science investigates has come into existence through a divine creator, through the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It has been created for a purpose, and it has been created for a certain duration. And the ultimate control and power of this world, this created world, is in the hand of the Creator. These are our fundamental beliefs coming from the Qur'an. Every Muslim believes that. Every Muslim believes that Allah is the Khaliqu kulli shay, huwa Khaliqu kulli shay. He is the creator of everything. When He desires to create something, He says kun fayakun, and it happens. We all believe that kullu shay halikun, everything is going to perish, illa wajhu, except His face. We all believe this. This is the basic teaching of the Qur'an. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created this marvelous cosmos, the stars, the planets, the sun, the moon, and they have an order. They have a divinely appointed order. The night cannot overtake the day, and the day cannot overtake the night. The cycles of seasons, the coming of the rain, the regeneration of water, all of these, we believe as from the teachings of the Qur'an, that these are divinely created structural orders. We also believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created human beings as khulafa fil earth. Khulafa, the plural of khalifa, we are the caretakers. We have been given the trust of the created order. The physical world that the sciences investigate, therefore, also have an ethical layer, a layer of ethics, of moral responsibility, based on the belief that this created order, this world, and all that it contains, has been entrusted to the human beings to manage and draw sustenance for our lives from it. That the animals and the plants and the fruits and the vegetables, they have a function. They have a function, they have a reason to be. They sustain human life, and human beings have a relationship with them to investigate their existence, and that is the function of sciences, but with a moral responsibility. Meaning that there is a layer of accountability built into how we relate to the natural world. These are fundamental aspects of the enterprise of science. These are embedded. We don't see them in the lab. The scientists working in Mashhad, for example, doing experiments, is not concerned with these questions. I just met with one of them, a very old friend. He's trying to use his knowledge to recycle the wastewater of Mashhad to produce energy. But built into that enterprise of investigating how to convert wastewater into energy and useful energy are layers of how we treat water as such, as a resource. We cannot take water for granted. Water from which every living thing has been created, as the Qur'an tells us, is a sacred trust given to us, because human beings cannot store water for all their needs at once. Like if you want to have water for the rest of your life in your house, you cannot do that. Water has to be regenerated through a very complex and complicated and interrelated phenomena. If we pollute the air of Tehran, the rain that's going to come down is going to be polluted water. That's going to have harmful effect on humans and the fish and the other creatures. So there is a sense of moral responsibility built into the structure of investigation of the natural world. As we go deeper and deeper into this question, I want to keep going back to the layers that we are building. Number one, the enterprise of science is a social activity. Number two, it's an economic activity. Number three, it's a political activity. And I will give some examples of the politics of science. Number four, and most fundamental, the object of investigation of science, the natural world, has embedded belief systems. Human beings have embedded belief systems about how they conceive the cosmos. That the scientists are studying the cosmos, the physical world. How is that object conceived? And then the last thing we did was to add a moral layer of moral relationship with the cosmos. The politics of science that I referred to is something that anybody can conclude by looking at the research funding. Scientists, of course, are always complaining that there are not enough funds being given to them everywhere. But if you look at the structure, the economic structure of the science today, where is the money coming from? Who is providing money for what and why? Science today is highly linked to the needs of the state. The Defense Department has certain goals to pursue. It needs knowledge created in the labs by scientists, by physicists, by chemists. It needs that knowledge to propagate certain political goals. Pharmaceutical industry has its own agenda, and it needs knowledge from the scientists to produce drugs from which it's going to make enormous amount of money. Food industry has its own agenda and driven by profits. Have you seen these bananas that we eat now? When you see the bananas, unfortunately, even in Iran, same bananas as we eat in Canada and America, all coming from where? From the banana republics. You have heard about banana republics. United States, certain companies in the United States invested tremendous amount of money to produce bananas in South America. And they were called banana republics because the state was controlled for the economic activity. If the bananas were to be transported from South America to Europe, to North America, to Iran, what did they need? They needed thicker skins so that bananas would not be bruised in the process of transportation. Thicker skins. These skins are not natural. Thicker skins were needed. Number two, they needed longer shelf life. So what did they do? They hired scientists to genetically modify bananas for the purpose of gaining more profits. In certain areas where rice is the staple, including Iran, but Thailand, most of Southeast Asia, Bangladesh, rice is eaten by millions of human beings as their basic food. So certain companies developed a certain variety of rice through genetic modification of the genes. And they went to Thailand and other places and said, here is a seed that is highly resistant to diseases, that would triple and quadruple your production. Use these seeds. Don't take your seeds. Throw away your old seeds and take these seeds. They are free. The farmer said, well, free seeds, triple the amount of production. They took them. But there was a catch. The catch was that next season, next year, they have to buy the seeds from the company. They couldn't keep that seed for next year's crops. Number two, these seeds would deplete the soil to such an extent that they would need chemicals. After 2 years, they would need fertilizers produced by the same company. And after a few years, the whole country would be dependent on this company to provide seeds and fertilizers. Otherwise, they wouldn't have any rice in their country. From genetics, from science of understanding the genetic structure of rice, we have now come to a politically controlled economy. That country can be destroyed. There could be famine in that country if the government of that country goes against the United States or Europe or wherever this other company is located. They cannot produce rice anymore, which is the staple of their food. So the question then, does science have politics involved? Does science have economics involved in it? What happens in the lab, does it have any moral agency attached, moral consequences attached to it? And most of all, what happens in the lab, does it have any meta-scientific content? I give you another example of the milk. The milk that we drink now, for centuries, ever since human beings came to this earth, they've been milking cows and goats and camels and having milk. But the milk that we now have, where does it come from? Of course, it still comes from the animals, alhamdulillah. They haven't found any artificial. But the milk that the animals produce now, the animals have been genetically modified. And there are huge areas, especially in North America and Europe, where these cows are standing in these tight stands. They only have this much room to move back and forth. They are standing there all day. And they are given genetically modified food. Hormones are introduced in their bodies. They produce tremendous amount of milk. But that's all they do. These animals, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created, have now been reduced to standing in these wooden stalls, eating and producing milk. What are the health consequences of this milk? This genetically modified milk that goes into our bodies? Nobody knows. Same thing with the chickens, with the eggs. The entire food chain has now been modified on the basis of science, science driven by the lust and greed of profits, with the greed of political control, with total disregard to any sanctity, total disregard to any sanctity of the species, the cows, the chickens, the fish. None of these creatures have any rights. They are just there to be chained and destroyed and modified. The bananas, the apples, all the fruits which the Qur'an tells us that we will find, inshallah, if we go to Jannah, we will find the same fruits, and then we'll say, these are similar to what we used to have. But from the secular point of view, they have absolutely no sanctity. They are just apples and bananas, and they can be changed because we want more profits. So does science have religion? Does science have religion? Of course, the scientist sitting in his lab and doing these modifications to the genetic structure, he or she is a small, very small part of a huge chain, a huge infrastructure and a huge new dimension that has emerged for the first time in human history in the form of this industrial military complex that now rules the world. We are all already enslaved and beholden to forces which are much more than we can imagine. The entire world is now beholden to the products being made in China, in one country. Try to find something that does not originate in China in its original sense. There are copies made in Iran and Pakistan and wherever, but the original design of everything or almost everything that we now use, where does it come from? Who put money into the design, into the original structure? Why? We have transformed our ways of living on the basis of technologies produced by modern science. We don't live anymore the way we used to live, our forefathers used to live. We live in a different world. We eat food that is generated and produced and transported in ways which were unthinkable even 50 years ago. We wear dresses, we construct our dwellings, our homes, our places of worship with a totally different knowledge base that came into existence over the last 300 years on the basis of a science that arose in a small part of the world on the basis of a concept of nature that was severed, removed, from which the hand of God was removed, cut off. Human wisdom and the considerations of this world made possible one branch of knowledge that now attempts to provide answers to every single thing, every single concept. Is it scientific? As soon as you hear the word scientific, people would surrender their will and say, yes, this must be true because this is scientific. And Muslims have a very complicated relationship with this question, whether or not science has a religion. Unfortunately, in the 80s, especially in the 1980s, certain ridiculous things were done to the debate of Islamic science, which made the debate a laughing stock. People started to find how many angels can be on the tip of a needle. people started to find every single discovery of modern science in the Qur'an. A huge new tafsir came out of this movement. And that made us a laughing stock, because the debate was derailed from its original sense. So if anyone now tries and attempts to say, wait a minute, you say science is neutral? What about all these layers and layers of the structure that is embedded in the enterprise of science? So the question then becomes, where is Islamic science? If we say that there is an Islamic way of investigating the natural world, if we say that there is sanctity, there is divine sanctity to the species, that it is immoral, unethical to modify the cows and the chickens and the birds and the fish for our gains, that is immoral and unethical to genetically modify bananas and apples and peaches, because we want more profits, we want longer shelf life, because we are khulafa, we are interested. We didn't create these things originally, they were given to us. So they ask, where is your science then? Why don't you have a different science? We have no answer to that. We have answers, we know the reasons. We have been asleep for 300 years. When modern science emerged in Europe, there was no interest in the Muslim world at that time. We were not short on resources. We had three powerful empires in the Muslim world: the Safavids, the Uthmani, and the Mughal. Tremendous resources were available. But when the telescope was brought to Istanbul, nobody wanted to have it. Nobody was interested in the telescope. And that gives people like Toby Huff the courage to say there is something wrong with Islam. They were not interested in knowledge. Which is ridiculous, because historically speaking, if we look at the long history of humanity, we can see that different civilizations produce sciences. The Greek science, the Roman science. And the longest scientific tradition ever to have existed in this world, in human history, was the enterprise of science that happened in the Muslim civilization, the Islamic civilization, for 800 years. How old is the modern science? When did it emerge? 16th century to now, let's say 400 years. Longest enterprise of science that humanity has known was housed in these lands, our lands. But when it came to the point of transformation, a radical transformation, a fundamental shift in the 17th century, we were asleep. The entire Muslim world was asleep at that time, intellectually speaking. And when, after the Second World War, these new countries emerged, there are 57 Muslim countries now, independent or so-called independent states. They have enormous amount of resources and wealth. But they haven't been able to produce an alternate way of investigating the natural world. They haven't been able to produce a different kind of science, a different kind of technology. So we cannot raise our head and say, this is the way of a science that would be anchored and rooted in a belief system that is different from your belief system. We haven't been able to do that. It doesn't mean that we will not be able to do this in the coming days and in the coming centuries or years or who knows when. But at least, the least that we can do today, right now, at this time, is to have an understanding of the enterprise of science that is not in these two yes or no answers, whether science has a religion or not. At least we can have an awareness that science is a human activity, civilizational activity. It is driven by political and economic forces, and there are different views of the natural world in different civilizations. That we as Muslims have a different view of the natural world, and therefore the methods and goals of investigation of the modern world of the natural world would be different. If we were to have a different philosophy of science, a different metaphysics of science, a different ethics of science, a different economy of science. If we were to investigate and use the resources of the natural world as khulafa, as individuals and collective bodies of humanity, believing in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and believing that we have been entrusted with these things, that these are amana, this is a trust, then we will not create this crisis that we have created. And the good thing is that batil, what is false, what is built on falsehood, cannot last by itself. So the world that has been created is doomed because the environmental crisis that has been created by the use of these resources and the manipulation of the natural world is itself leading us to this terrible, terrible tragedies. Because the natural world has, as collectivity, it has its own response. If we go and cut the forests of Amazon, if we destroy the natural world is going to respond. The floods would come. There'll be shortage of water. There'll be pollution. There'll be diseases. Diseases unknown to humanity until now would emerge because we are putting things in our bodies which are not harmonious with the nature of this body. Who had heard the kinds of diseases that we now have? They were unknown. And they have a direct relationship to what goes into the bodies. So because of this, there is an urgent need for Muslims to wake up and say, wait a minute, now we are not dominated by you, we are not colonized, we have some kind of independence. We need to come out with our own framework of investigating the natural world. It's a long task. It's not going to happen in one generation either. And there will be people in the process who would say, no, it doesn't, you don't need to do it. Science is just science, just give me funds and let me do my research. But we need to increase the awareness. We need to establish an Islamic framework of investigating the natural world, and the sciences which would emerge out of that framework would be Islamic science. I hope I have said enough. I would really love to interact with you and hear your thoughts, and perhaps we can have more discussion. Jazakallah khairan. Assalamu alaikum.